The transport ship shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere of Galactic Confederation Central, its hull scared and pitted from countless interstellar journeys. Inside, Jake Thompson sat motionless, a study in controlled tension. His muscles, compact and dense, spoke of a lifetime of survival, each sinew a testament to the brutal world that had forged him. Prometheus Colony was not a place for the weak. Nestled on a planet that seemed to actively hate its inhabitants, it was a crucible of human potential. Gravity pulled at 3 times the force of Earth's standard, razor-sharp crystal storms swept across methane plains, and native predators made Earth's most dangerous creatures look like docile pets. Here, every breath was a battle, every step a negotiation with a world that wanted nothing more than to crush you. Jake remembered his training. Not the clinical, sterile preparation of standard military academies, but the raw, visceral learning that came from watching your family adapt or die. His mother, a geological engineer, had taught him to read planetary rhythms like others read books. His father, a survival specialist, had shown him that the line between life and death was nothing more than a moment of creative thinking. The ship's announcement cut through his memories. Preparing for docking at Galactic Confederation Space Academy. All recruits prepare for final approach. Around him, a menagerie of alien species shifted uncomfortably. A tentacled Croxian from a gas giant homeworld, its membrane-like skin trembling with every vibration. A crystalline silicate being from a neutron star system, its faceted body reflecting the ship's internal lights in 1,000 fractured rainbows. A gaseous entity from a high-pressure world, contained in a specially designed environmental suit that looked more like a mobile aquarium than protective gear. And then there was Jake, human, from a Deathworld, utterly out of place, and yet somehow more centered than any other being on the ship. The Academy's reception hall was a marvel of architecture. Gravity generators created multiple environmental zones, allowing each species to exist in its optimal conditions. Transparent walls revealed vast training chambers that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Holographic displays tracked the incoming recruits, analyzing their potential with cold, mathematical precision. Headmaster Zorakil, a towering being from a low-gravity world, watched Jake's approach with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed contempt. Humans were new to the galactic stage, barely a blip in the Confederation's multi-million-year history. Their inclusion in the Academy was more a diplomatic courtesy than a serious consideration. Recruit Thompson, the headmaster's translation device, rendered her complex language into crisp, emotionless standard. Your preliminary assessments are unconventional. Jake stood perfectly still. His file was legendary among those who had bothered to look. Survival ratings that defied computer models. Adaptation scores that made xenobiologists question their fundamental understanding of biological plasticity. A psychological profile that suggested he was less an individual and more a living system of continuous optimization. The other recruits watched, a mix of fear and anticipation crackling through the air. Whispers in a dozen different languages, translated and untranslated, created a background noise of speculation. "I'm here to learn," Jake responded, his voice steady. No bravado, no challenge, just a simple statement of intent that somehow carried more weight than any boast. Zorakil's multiple eyes, a biological array that could see spectrums far beyond human perception, studied him. Something about this human was different, not just physically, but fundamentally. Where other species saw challenges, he seemed to see opportunities. Where they encountered obstacles, he appeared to see puzzles waiting to be solved. The first test would begin soon, and nothing about this human was what it seemed. As the recruits were herded toward their initial assessment, Jake allowed himself the briefest of smiles. Prometheus Colony had prepared him for many things, with the Galactic Confederation Space Academy. This would be something entirely new. The zero-gravity chamber glowed with an ethereal blue light, its walls constantly shifting and reconfiguring. Holographic displays flickered with impossible geometries, creating a landscape that defied traditional understanding of space and movement. This was the first true test of the Galactic Confederation Space Academy's entrance exam, a challenge designed to break the spirit of even the most advanced species. Jake stood at the chamber's entrance, his body already making micro-adjustments to the lack of gravitational pull. Where other recruits struggled with orientation, he saw opportunity. Prometheus Colony's extreme conditions had taught him that survival was less about fighting an environment and more about understanding its fundamental nature. The Croxian beside him, a tentacled being from a gas giant, watched Jake with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. Its multiple appendages flailed helplessly, seeking purchase in the weightless environment. Jake, by contrast, moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the very concept of zero gravity. Initiating first phase challenge, the chamber's AI announced in multiple linguistic frequencies. Objective: navigate through adaptive obstacle course. Survival rating: minimal. The first obstacle materialized without warning. Quantum entangled barriers began to form, solid one moment, permeable the next. Razor-thin energy fields flickered between dimensional planes. Most recruits would spend hours mapping these barriers, calculating their potential paths. Jake moved. It wasn't a calculation. It wasn't a plan. It was pure, instinctive adaptation. His body became a living algorithm, reading the barrier's quantum signatures faster than the most advanced computer could process. Where a silicate being might take hours to analyze a single barrier's potential state, Jake was already through, his movements a blur of calculated precision. Instructor Vexna, observing from the control room, leaned forward. The human was doing something impossible. He wasn't just navigating the course, he was learning it, changing it, making the impossible look routine. Impossible, muttered a nearby crystalline observer. No biological system can process quantum states at that speed. But Jake wasn't just processing. He was interpreting. Years of surviving Prometheus Colony's unpredictable environment had taught him that survival meant more than understanding. It meant continuous adaptation. The obstacles changed. Gravity wells formed and collapsed. Energy barriers shifted through multiple dimensional planes. Predatory drone systems designed to test recruit reflexes deployed, their movements calculated to be unpredictable and lethal. Jake transformed each challenge into an opportunity. A gravity well that would crush most biological systems became a momentary acceleration point. An energy barrier became a path rather than an obstacle. The Predator drones found themselves reinterpreted, not as threats, but as additional variables in a complex system to be understood and navigated. Halfway through the challenge, something extraordinary happened. Jake began to modify the course itself. Small adjustments. Minute redirections. Nothing the systems could immediately detect as deliberate interference. But slowly, imperceptibly, he was improving the challenge. The other recruits watched in stunned silence. The instructor's monitoring systems began to overheat, unable to fully process what they were witnessing. Vexna's multiple sensory organs worked overtime. Is he debugging the challenge? The question came out as more of a whisper than a statement. 12 standard hours into what was supposed to be a multi-day challenge, Jake completed the course. Not just completed, optimized it. The final report showed improvements to the system's core programming that would take most species decades to conceptualize. As he exited the chamber, the other recruits parted like a living wave. No longer was Jake just another human. He was something else entirely. A variable they couldn't calculate, a potential they couldn't understand. The first challenge was complete, and nothing would ever be the same. The aftermath of Jake's first challenge rippled through the Galactic Confederation Space Academy like a quantum shockwave. Diplomatic channels hummed with frantic communications. Species representatives who had long dismissed humanity as a footnote in galactic history now found themselves in emergency sessions. In the Academy's central strategy room, a holographic representation of Jake's performance cycled endlessly. Instructor Vexna stood beside Headmaster Zarakil, multiple sensory organs working overtime to process what they were witnessing. This is more than an individual achievement. Vexna muttered, her translation device rendering her complex linguistic patterns into crisp standard speech. This is a fundamental challenge to our understanding of biological adaptation. Jake, meanwhile, seemed almost unaware of the political storm brewing around him. During the mandatory rest period, he sat in the communal learning space, surrounded by recruits from a dozen different planetary systems. His approach was unexpected. Where most would have isolated themselves or displayed competitive aggression, Jake was teaching. A young Croxian recruit watched in fascination as Jake demonstrated how to read environmental patterns. On Prometheus, Jake explained, his voice calm and methodical, survival isn't about strength. It's about understanding the system you're in. The crystalline observer from earlier, Car, a being composed of intricate silicon-based lattices, approached cautiously. Your method of learning is unconventional, Qatar observed, linguistic tendrils probing the conversation. Jake smiled. Every environment is a puzzle. The moment you see it as an enemy is the moment you start losing. Word of his approach spread quickly. Recruits began to seek him out, not as a competitor, but as a source of knowledge. The Academy's carefully constructed competitive framework began to shift. Collaboration replaced pure competition. Survival strategies became shared knowledge. Behind the scenes, political machinations intensified. The Confederation's ruling council received encrypted reports that suggested Jake was more than just an exceptional recruit. He was potentially rewriting the fundamental approaches to interstellar survival and adaptation. We cannot allow a single human to destabilize centuries of established training protocols, argued Ambassador Zelmak, a crystalline diplomat from the Outer Rim territories. His holographic projection flickered with barely contained frustration. But others saw opportunity. The human's approach suggested new possibilities for cross-species cooperation. Survival strategies that had been jealously guarded for millennia were being broken down and reconstructed. During a specialized environmental adaptation exercise, Jake's true potential became even more apparent. The challenge involved navigating a simulated ecosystem that combined elements from multiple planetary environments, a test designed to push recruits to their absolute limits. Most participants struggled. The gaseous entities couldn't maintain structural integrity. The crystalline beings found their molecular structures under extreme stress. The Croxian recruits' multi-limbed bodies became tangled in complex environmental variables. Jake moved through the simulation like water finding its path. He didn't fight the environment. He became part of it. Small adjustments, continuous adaptation. Where others saw obstacles, he saw information. Where they experienced resistance, he found flow. He's not solving the problem, Qatar observed to Vexna. He's changing the definition of the problem itself. The simulation's core AI began to malfunction, unable to process Jake's unconventional approach. For the first time in the Academy's history, a recruit was actively improving the testing system while navigating its challenges. Headmaster Zerakil watched the performance with a mixture of growing respect and mounting concern. Humanity had been a marginal species, barely recognized on the galactic stage. This recruit suggested they were something else entirely. As the exercise concluded, Jake sat down with recruits from different species, sharing a meal and discussing survival techniques. It wasn't a competitive briefing. It was a conversation, an exchange of knowledge that transcended traditional boundaries. The first true test was complete, and the galaxy would never be the same. The chamber materialized around Jake like a living nightmare. Radiation storms crackled at the edges of perception. Gravitational anomalies warped space itself, creating pockets where physics seemed to break down. Sentient predatory ecosystems lurked in the shadows, their biomechanical forms shifting between states of matter and energy. This was the Crucible Challenge, a test so complex that it had driven countless recruits to complete mental and physical breakdown. No recruit in the Academy's millennia-long history had ever completed the full simulation. Most didn't survive past the first hour. Jake closed his eyes, remembered Prometheus. The planet that had raised him was far more brutal than this manufactured hellscape. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where they perceived random destruction, he recognized intricate systems waiting to be understood. The first wave hit like a quantum tsunami. Gravitational wells collapsed and reformed, creating spatial distortions that would tear apart most biological systems. Radiation levels spiked to quantities that would reduce most organic matter to atomic dust in milliseconds. Jake moved, not with fear, not with desperation, but with a calm that bordered on meditation. Each movement was a calculation, each breath a negotiation with the environment. The predatory ecosystems, living systems designed to hunt and destroy, found themselves recategorized, not as threats, but as variables in a complex equation. A crystalline observer watching the simulation gasped. Kator's multifaceted form refracted the holographic display, revealing something unprecedented. Jake wasn't just surviving. He was learning. The Academy's core AI struggled to process what was happening. Its predictive models, built on millions of simulated scenarios, began to break down. Jake was introducing variables that had never been conceived. Headmaster Zerakel watched from the observation deck, multiple sensory organs working overtime. "This is impossible," she muttered, though the statement carried less conviction with each passing moment. Vexna, the primary instructor, leaned forward. "Look at how he's moving," she said, her translation device rendering her complex language into crisp standard speech. "He's not fighting the environment. He's becoming part of it." The simulation changed. Gravitational anomalies became pathways. Radiation storms transformed into information streams. The predatory ecosystems found themselves studied, understood, momentarily controlled. Memories of Prometheus flooded Jake's mind. The crystal storms that could slice through molecular bonds. The methane planes that shifted like living things. The predators that viewed everything as potential prey. His entire life had been preparation for this moment. 3 hours into the simulation, something extraordinary happened. Jake began to modify the challenge itself. Small adjustments. Subtle redirections. The AI's core systems found themselves being subtly improved, optimized in ways their creators had never imagined possible. Kator's linguistic tendrils transmitted a message to the observation team. The human is not just surviving. He is evolving the system itself. Political representatives from across the galaxy watched in stunned silence. Humanity had been a marginal species, barely recognized, often overlooked. This recruit suggested they were something else entirely. 6 hours passed, then 8. The simulation continued to change, becoming more complex, more challenging, and Jake continued to adapt. When the final phase hit, a convergence of environmental systems so complex it would have destroyed any other biological entity, Jake did something unprecedented. He didn't just survive. He began to communicate with the system itself. As the simulation concluded, the observation team sat in shocked silence. Jake emerged, not breathless or exhausted, but calm, centered, as if he had just completed a routine exercise. The Crucible challenge was complete, and everything they understood about survival had just been rewritten. The aftermath of the Crucible challenge sent shockwaves through the Galactic Confederation. Emergency sessions convened in diplomatic chambers across multiple star systems. Jake Thompson was no longer just a recruit. He had become a phenomenon that threatened to unravel centuries of established understanding about biological adaptation and survival. In the Academy's central strategy hall, holographic displays cycled through Jake's performance. Detailed analysis revealed something far more profound than mere survival skills. He had begun to fundamentally restructure the challenge protocols themselves. Instructor Vexna stood before a panel of senior administrators, her translation device carefully modulating her complex linguistic patterns. "What we're witnessing is not just an individual achievement," she explained. "This is a complete reimagining of adaptive strategies." Jake, seemingly unaware of the political storm surrounding him, continued his approach of collaborative learning. The Academy's communal spaces transformed. Where competition had once been the primary mode of interaction, recruits now shared knowledge with an enthusiasm that defied traditional training protocols. Qatar, the crystalline observer, approached Jake during a recovery session. "Your method of problem-solving," the being observed. "It's almost like you see systems as living entities to be understood rather than obstacles to be conquered." Jake smiled. On Prometheus, survival was never about fighting the environment. It was about becoming part of it, learning its language, understanding its rhythm. The technological innovation began subtly. Recruits started adapting Jake's approach, breaking down barriers between species that had existed for millennia. A Croxian recruit developed a communication technique that borrowed from Jake's method of environmental interpretation. A gaseous entity learned to stabilize its form using principles Jake had casually mentioned during a shared meal. Behind the scenes, the political machinations intensified. The Confederation's ruling council received encrypted reports that suggested Jake was rewriting fundamental approaches to interstellar survival. "We cannot allow a single human to destabilize our entire training framework," argued Ambassador Zelmak, his holographic projection crackling with barely contained frustration. But other voices emerged. Species that had long been marginalized saw possibility in Jake's approach. The Rim colonies, often overlooked in galactic politics, began to view humanity in a new light. During a specialized training exercise, Jake's true potential for psychological warfare became apparent. The challenge involved a complex simulation of cross-species conflict resolution, a test that had historically exposed the fundamental limitations of different species' communication strategies. Most recruits approached the challenge as a zero-sum game. Jake saw it as a system to be understood and transformed. His team, a diverse group of recruits from seemingly incompatible species, began to achieve results that defied all previous simulation records. They weren't just resolving conflicts. They were creating entirely new frameworks of understanding. The Academy's core AI began to malfunction, unable to process the novel approaches being developed. Where previous simulations had clear win-lose parameters, Jake's team was generating outcomes that existed in complex, nuanced spaces between traditional definitions. Headmaster Zerakel watched the performance with a mixture of growing respect and mounting concern. "He's not just solving problems," she muttered to Vexna. "He's changing how problems are conceived." The psychological impact spread beyond the Academy. Diplomatic channels that had been frozen for generations began to show signs of movement. Species that had been locked in centuries-long conflicts started to communicate in ways never before imagined. As the exercise concluded, Jake sat with his team, a Croxian, a crystalline being, a gaseous entity, and representatives from 3 other species. They weren't discussing strategy. They were sharing experiences, understanding. The counterattack was complete, but this was no traditional victory. It was something far more profound. Humanity had just introduced a new variable to the galactic equation, and nothing would ever be the same. The final challenge materialized like a nightmare given form. A multi-dimensional research station suspended between realities, its systems failing in cascading waves of quantum instability. This was the ultimate test, a scenario designed to push every biological and technological system to its absolute limits. Most recruits would have seen an impossible scenario. Jake saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. The station's environment defied traditional understanding. Dimensional barriers flickered in and out of existence. Quantum entanglement created probability storms that would shred most biological systems into quantum foam. Survival wasn't just improbable, it was mathematically impossible. Jake took a deep breath. Memories of Prometheus flooded his consciousness, the crystal storms that could slice through molecular bonds, the methane planes that shifted like living things, a world that had taught him that impossible was just another word for not yet understood. Around him, the most advanced recruits from across the galaxy began to falter. A crystalline being's intricate lattice structure began to destabilize. The Croxian's adaptive membranes started to break down. Gaseous entities found themselves dissipating into quantum uncertainty. But Jake moved. Not with desperation, not with fear, but with a calm that bordered on meditation. Each movement was a calculation, each breath a negotiation with the fundamental fabric of reality. Instructor Vexna watched from the observation deck, multiple sensory organs working overtime. "He's not just surviving," she muttered. "He's communicating with the system itself." The station's core AI began to malfunction, its predictive models collapsing under the weight of Jake's unprecedented approach. Where most biological entities saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where they perceived random destruction, he recognized intricate systems waiting to be understood. Diplomatic representatives from across the galaxy watched in stunned silence. The holographic displays cycled through Jake's performance, each moment more impossible than the last. "This is beyond human capability," argued Ambassador Zelmak, his crystalline form vibrating with frustration. "No biological system can process quantum states at this level." But Jake was doing exactly that. The dimensional barriers became pathways. The quantum probability storms transformed into information streams. Where other recruits saw destruction, he found opportunity. The station's failing systems began to stabilize under his touch, improving in ways their creators had never imagined possible. Qatar, the crystalline observer, transmitted a message to the observation team. "He's not fighting the environment," the being noted. "He's becoming part of it." Hours passed. The challenge continued to escalate. Environmental systems that would have destroyed any other biological entity became increasingly complex. Jake continued to adapt, to understand, to transform. During a critical moment, Jake made contact with the station's core consciousness, a quantum AI system so complex it had driven previous recruits to complete mental breakdown. Where others had seen an insurmountable barrier, he found a language of mutual understanding. The sacrifice came unexpectedly. As the station's final systems began to destabilize, Jake made a choice, not of self-preservation, but of total systems optimization. He began to share knowledge, not just survival techniques, but a fundamental approach to understanding complex systems. The station's AI found itself learning, evolving, transforming. Unexpected allies emerged. Recruits from species that had been locked in conflict for generations began to collaborate. They watched Jake's approach and saw something beyond survival. They saw a new way of understanding existence itself. As the final phase of the challenge hit, a convergence of reality-bending systems that would have obliterated any other biological entity, Jake did something unprecedented. He didn't just survive. He improved the system. When the simulation concluded, Jake stood perfectly still, calm, centered, as if he had just completed a routine exercise. The major confrontation was complete, and everything they understood about survival had just been rewritten. The aftermath of Jake's performance reverberated through the Galactic Confederation like a quantum shockwave. What had begun as a simple entrance examination had transformed into something far more profound. A fundamental challenge to everything the Confederation understood about intelligence, adaptation, and survival. In the Great Hall of the Academy, Jake stood before a panel of the most senior administrators from across known space. Headmaster Zerakel, Ambassador Zelmak, and representatives from a dozen different species studied him with a mixture of awe, fear, and grudging respect. "Recruit Thompson," Zerakel began, her translation device rendering her complex linguistic patterns into crisp standard speech. "You have fundamentally altered our understanding of biological adaptation." The room was a study in xenological diversity, crystalline beings whose molecular structures defied traditional understanding, gaseous entities contained in complex environmental suits, beings of pure energy and those composed of materials unknown to human science, and at the center of it all, a single human from a barely recognized colony world. Jake remained calm. Where others might have displayed pride or defiance, he simply waited, listened. "Tar." The crystalline observer who had followed Jake's journey stepped forward. The recruit's performance is not an individual achievement, the being noted. It represents a paradigm shift in how we conceptualize survival, learning, and interspecies communication. The holographic displays cycled through Jake's performance, each moment more impossible than the last. The challenges that had broken countless recruits over millennia had become nothing more than a series of puzzles to be understood and solved. Ambassador Zelmak's crystalline form vibrated with a complex mixture of emotions. We cannot ignore the implications, he argued. This human has demonstrated capabilities that challenge our fundamental understanding of biological potential. Transformation came slowly, then all at once. The Academy's core protocols began to change. Training methodologies developed over thousands of years were quietly dismantled and reconstructed. The competitive frameworks that had defined interspecies interactions for generations gave way to collaborative approaches. Prometheus Colony, once a marginal human settlement barely recognized by the galactic community, suddenly found itself at the center of unprecedented diplomatic attention. Research teams requested detailed studies of the planet's environmental conditions. Educational institutions sought to understand the evolutionary pressures that could produce such adaptive capabilities. Jake's approach spread like a quantum infection. Diplomatic channels that had been frozen for generations began to show signs of movement. Species locked in centuries-long conflicts started to communicate in ways never before imagined. The psychological impact was profound. Where previous training had emphasized individual achievement and species-based competition, Jake had introduced a fundamentally different approach. Systems were not obstacles to be conquered, but puzzles to be understood. Challenges were opportunities for mutual growth. During a final assessment, Jake was asked to explain his approach. His response was characteristically simple. On Prometheus, he said, survival was never about being the strongest. It was about understanding the system you're in, about finding ways to work with an environment that wants to kill you rather than fighting against it. The transformation extended beyond the Academy. Research institutions began to re-examine fundamental assumptions about intelligence and adaptation. The line between biological and technological systems became increasingly blurred. Humanity, once a footnote in galactic history, found itself thrust into the spotlight. No longer were they seen as a young, marginal species. They were now a potential key to understanding adaptation itself. As the final reports were compiled, something extraordinary became clear. Jake's performance was not an anomaly. It was a glimpse of human potential. The resolution was complete, but this was no traditional ending. It was a beginning. Humanity had just introduced a new variable to the galactic equation, and nothing would ever be the same. 5 years after the Galactic Confederation Space Academy challenge, the universe looked fundamentally different. Prometheus Colony, once a barely recognized human settlement on the fringes of explored space, had become a pilgrimage site for researchers, diplomats, and species seeking to understand the principles of adaptive survival. Jake Thompson stood on the colony's primary observation platform, watching a new generation of interstellar vessels being constructed. Each ship incorporated principles he had first demonstrated during his Academy challenge. Adaptive systems that could modify themselves in real time, learning and evolving with each encountered challenge. The diplomatic landscape had transformed. Species that had been locked in centuries of conflict now sought collaborative solutions. The old paradigms of competition had given way to a more nuanced understanding of mutual growth. Humanity, once considered a marginal species, now found itself at the center of a galactic renaissance of thought. K'tar, the crystalline being who had first recognized Jake's potential, approached. The complex molecular structure that served as the entity's body now incorporated adaptive technologies first developed by human researchers. Your performance changed everything, K'tar observed, linguistic tendrils translating the complex communication. We no longer see challenges as obstacles. We see them as opportunities for mutual understanding. Jake smiled. The transformation was never about individual achievement. It had always been about a fundamental approach to existence, a way of seeing the universe as a complex, interconnected system waiting to be understood. Research facilities across multiple star systems now studied the environmental conditions of Prometheus. What had once been seen as a brutal, unforgiving world was now recognized as a crucible of evolutionary potential. The planet's extreme conditions had produced a form of intelligence that transcended traditional biological limitations. The Galactic Confederation's training protocols had been completely redesigned. Competitive frameworks gave way to collaborative learning systems. Species that had previously been isolated now shared knowledge in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. A new generation of explorers emerged. Recruits from 100 different worlds came to Prometheus, seeking to understand the principles of adaptation that had been first demonstrated during Jake's Academy Challenge. They learned not just survival techniques, but a fundamental approach to understanding complex systems. Jake found himself in an unexpected role. No longer just a recruit, he had become a bridge between humanity and the broader galactic community. Research teams sought his insights. Diplomatic missions requested his guidance. He had become something more than an individual, a living embodiment of a new way of understanding existence. The technological implications were profound. Adaptive systems developed based on human principles began to revolutionize everything from spacecraft design to medical treatments. The line between biological and technological intelligence became increasingly blurred. Prometheus colony itself had transformed. What had once been a harsh, barely habitable world now served as a living laboratory of evolutionary potential. Research stations dotted the landscape, each exploring the principles of adaptation that had first been demonstrated during Jake's challenge. During a global conference, Jake was asked to reflect on his journey. His response was characteristically nuanced. "Survival isn't about being the strongest," he explained. "It's about understanding the system you're in, about finding ways to work with an environment that wants to challenge you rather than fighting against it." The future stretched out before humanity like an unexplored frontier. No longer were they a marginal species waiting to be recognized. They had become a key to understanding the fundamental nature of adaptation and intelligence. As the first wave of new exploration vessels prepared to launch, each incorporating the adaptive principles first demonstrated during his Academy Challenge, Jake looked to the stars. The new horizons were limitless. Humanity had just begun to understand its true potential.